Pessimism, disappointment, and shattered illusions penetrated the consciousness of Americans during the Great Depression of the 1930s and persisted into the subsequent 1940s, marked by World War II, the Holocaust, atomic bombs, and the beginning of the Cold War. In 1945, in the United States, the industrial boom had not yet led to the development of the consumer era and the flourishing of the American dream. Citizens' lives in the unstable peacetime economy were characterized by black and white simplicity. But into this unpretentious noir lifestyle, passionate love affairs and vices would occasionally burst in with a bright light effect. And along with them, of course, came crimes. This is Arthur Eggers, a cuckolded husband who committed murder out of sexual anger, as his cheerful wife Dorothy apparently slept around with everyone and mocked Arthur's impotence and spinelessness. The fatal culmination of their relationship occurred when Eggers was returning home from work late in the evening on December 28, 1945, and saw a man leaving his house. Arthur rushed to the bedroom and found his wife naked in bed. Instead of repenting or at least denying everything, Dorothy again began to mock Arthur. Yes, she was having an affair. So what was her spineless husband going to do about it? You'll learn what Arthur Eggers did from this video, as well as how Eggers tried to get away with it, about the sensational trial, and how justice disposed of the life of a criminal whose oddities bordered on insanity. The San Bernardino Mountains, located in Southern California, encompass a vast wild region with rocky peaks and mountain forests. On the morning of January 2, 1946, two men in a car were climbing the steep slope of Waterman Canyon. Along the winding road known as the Rim World Highway, they ascended 900 meters above sea level in 6 kilometers. The engine overheated, and to let it cool down and add water to the radiator, the man pulled over onto a wide shoulder. The old cars from the 1930s that were still in use after the end of World War II, cooling problems were common. The two men stood by a rocky outcrop waiting for the engine to cool down. The panoramic view of the valley stretching far below was breathtaking. The ochre-toned nature extended from the desert to alpine peaks, from blooming cacti to eagles soaring above tall pines. When one of the travelers accidentally lowered his gaze into the ravine, he saw an equally captivating sight. From under a wide green blanket, resembling a shroud and tied with rope, someone's pale feet were visible. The San Bernardino County Sheriff, 8 of his deputies, and the coroner arrived at the scene and, using ropes and climbing equipment, retrieved a woman's corpse from the ravine. The body was dismembered. The head and hands were missing. Apparently, they had been sawed off. In the center of the woman's chest, who was between 35 and 40 years old, a bullet hole was clearly visible. Another one was found on her left side, under the armpit. Apart from an old scar on her ankle, the only distinguishing feature of the victim was enlarged joints on her big toes. The problem was so apparent and severe that the woman must have sought medical attention in the past. This could become a lead in the case. Except for a few vague tire tracks on the ground, the killer left no clues. It seems he had pulled over to the shoulder, transferred the woman's body from his car to the edge of the cliff, and simply dropped her into the ravine sometime within the last 24 hours. But the location of the body gave investigators one clue. The killer was not from around here. Anyone who lived nearby would have known plenty of the other spots in the San Bernardino Mountains where the body could be hidden so that it would never be found. From the perspective of conveniently disposing of corpses, this area was a poor choice. The story of the headless woman found in Waterman Canyon made the front pages of local newspapers that same day. Radio stations interrupted their regular broadcasts to report on the horrific discovery. Within just a few hours, the San Bernardino Sheriff's Office received over 100 phone calls from people requesting more detailed information or permission to view the body. By the next morning, there were countless calls, leads, and inquiries coming in from all over the western United States. But it wasn't these that led on unraveling the identity of the victim of this brutal murder. Temple City is now located 60 kilometers from San Bernardino. Behind the story of the proud Temple family, who are the founders of the city, lies the romance of ranch life, the valor of pioneering dons, and the charm of beautiful señoritas, as well as the history of the San Gabriel Valley, from which many street names in this city originated. An hour or two after the first radio broadcast with the news of the shocking discovery aired, something extraordinary happened at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department station in Temple City. "I'd like to report my wife missing," said Arthur Eggers to the deputy sheriff, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses on his nose. This was an unexpected statement from this shy and quiet 51-year-old man. The deputy sheriff hadn't looked up when Arthur entered the office, but now stared at his colleague in surprise. Arthur had diligently worked as a clerk in this police station for the past 22 years, continuing a career that had become a family tradition. Eggers was the son of a former San Francisco County sheriff. Every morning, Arthur's arrival at work was announced by the cheerful chime of an old-fashioned doorbell, its reflections glinting off the clerk's bald spots. The chimes usually contrasted sharply with Arthur's serious expression. He didn't smile even in family photos. He spent whole days at the station, filing out papers, staring at the phone and listening to the hiss of the police radio. Filing the report, Arthur put forward his version of events. He had last seen Dorothy 3 days earlier, around 9 in the morning, and in his opinion his wife had run off with another man. Colleagues at the station knew that Dorothy was a cheerful, restless 42-year-old housewife. She clearly dominated her husband in everything, and because of this, the marriage was difficult. But to run away with a lover? From the moment Eggers began to speak, his station colleagues had alarming suspicions. Maybe Arthur really didn't realize that his poorly constructed version wouldn't stand up to any criticism. The police were already investigating the discovery of a headless body, and the dots in this case and Arthur's report of his missing wife would soon connect in the most horrific way. In attempts to identify the headless body, law enforcement officers from 2 counties planned to review their missing persons files for any distinguishing features that would match the body found in Waterman Canyon. Despite the absence of a head, the coroner measured the unknown woman from shoulders to feet and determined that her height was 1.70 meters or 1.75 meters. When the police in Temple City considered Arthur's missing person report, they noticed something strange. He described Dorothy's height as 157 centimeters. The police station employees who were friends with this couple knew for certain that her height was no less than 1.70 meters, the same as the woman found in Waterman Canyon. And Arthur's description of his wife was surprisingly inaccurate. The unidentified headless corpse nagged at the police. Could it be the missing Dorothy Eggers? Arthur's statement and the discovery of the body on the same day seemed too much of coincidence to ignore. Also suspicious was Arthur's assumption that Dorothy had probably run off with a truck driver. He spoke of his wife's infidelity with cold nonchalance and didn't seem like a concerned and worried spouse. Colleagues politely asked Arthur if he entertained the thought that the unknown woman from San Bernardino might be his wife. "Yes, I thought about that," Arthur replied. "That's why I filed an official report for the record. I was at the morgue last night and saw her, but thank God it's not Dorothy." Eggers lied. Although he did go to the coroner's office in San Bernardino, Arthur never looked at the body. He just wandered around a bit and then left. But before returning to Temple City, Eggers called his brother-in-law in Los Angeles, and since he didn't answer the phone, asked the dispatcher to transfer the call to his home. There, Lester Loomis, a tenant renting a room from the Eggers, answered the phone. Arthur told Loomis that he had seen the body and it didn't belong to Dorothy because the feet were too big, like Greta Garbo's, Arthur said, alluding the famous actress's size 42 shoes. The deputy sheriffs learned about this lie as well and began a secret investigation into their colleague. They politely offered to drive Arthur to Kramer's morgue in San Bernardino for re-identification of the body, but this time accompanied by Sheriff Emmett Shea. This could be a turning point in the case, as the suspect's reaction to the body, a lack thereof, could tell detectives a lot. When the officers led Eggers to the table where the corpse lay, he made a motion as if he wanted to lift the sheet himself. Sheriff Shea pulled back the cloth, but only revealed the chest and shoulders of the deceased. Arthur wasn't sure. Then they showed him the whole body. Eggers studied it for a minute and then said, "Is that how they found her, Sheriff?" and pointed to the incision made by the pathologist. He seemed not to notice that the body had no head. "No, that's the result of the autopsy," Shea replied. The police noted that the man showed no emotion and was surprisingly calm. Arthur carefully examined the feet, legs, thighs, and arms for scars that he said his wife had. He admitted that it must be Dorothy. "It looks a bit like her, Sheriff," Arthur said coldly. "I'll take the body." When Eggers was asked why he didn't claim the body when he first saw it, he had an excuse ready. "I lied for the sake of my wife's elderly mother. I didn't want to upset her." According to Eggers' version, his wife was killed by one of her lovers. "I wouldn't have touched a hair of her head," Arthur told the police. The investigators pretended to believe him. They communicated with Arthur Eggers as usual and gave him no hint that he was a suspect. But outside the office, detectives were already digging into the couple's personal life. Dorothy Armand Lee Eggers was born on March 23, 1903, in North Dakota. She and her husband, Arthur Robert Eggers, who was 9 years older than his chosen one, lived in House 202 on North Rosemead Boulevard in Temple City. It was a single-story bungalow with red tiles surrounded by a white fence. In the living room, a white cat, Dorothy's favorite, usually slept on glossy floral patterned sofa cushions. This was Arthur's second marriage. The couple had no children together, but they were raising two of Dorothy's nieces, Marie, who was 19 at the time of these events, and 11-year-old Lorraine. One of the bungalow's rooms was rented out, and for the past 2 years, Lester Loomis had been living there. As investigators delved deeper into the Eggers family life, a picture of disagreements and problems began to emerge. Arthur seemed to everyone a meek, patient little man who was afraid of his own shadow and was under the influence of his wife. He spoke quietly and lived unpretentiously. He didn't even have his own car. The family's 1940 Plymouth belonged to Dorothy. When they appeared in society, Dorothy would stride out with a firm gait and radiant with a confident smile, while her husband shuffled behind her. The couple attended department events where police officers and their wives danced so energetically that glasses and silverware clinked on the long table's white tablecloths. Usually, Eggers stood submissively to the side like a decorative addition to the fan-shaped flags, a bit worn and faded, much like himself. Arthur just watched his pale blue eyes as his glittering wife in an elegant blue dress with a string of pearls danced with colleagues who looked so unfamiliar without their uniforms. From Dorothy's friends, investigators learned that the woman was tired of Arthur, to whom she had been married for 18 years. Perhaps initially he attracted her with his sweet, soft, and pliable character. But soon this began to irritate the strong-willed woman. Dorothy valued the good qualities in her husband, but realized that she was losing more and more respect for him. To stand one's ground, one needs to show strong qualities: intelligence, rebelliousness, cunning, love of freedom. But sometimes close people become witnesses or even victims of the manifestation of these character traits. Dorothy nagged her husband for not doing things. If he did something, she reproached him for not doing it right. She mocked Arthur for his lack of courage and called him a little slug, among other hurtful epithets. She took out her dissatisfaction with their marriage and any trifle on her husband. Perhaps, deep down, Dorothy wanted Arthur to assert his masculinity and stand up to her. This seems illogical, but the way to reason with a controlling person is to assert oneself and do what seems right, not what they demand. But Arthur couldn't stand up for himself. Each time he surrendered to Dorothy's mercy and submitted to her behavior, resigning himself to his fate, he failed her unspoken test. Perhaps Dorothy did this unconsciously, but she went further and further in attempts to stir up her husband's strength of character. The situation became absurd. It got to the point where Arthur became a submissive cuckold. Dorothy began meeting other men, and she absolutely didn't care if Arthur found out about it. The Eggers neighbors recalled that the married woman had an indecent number of male visitors, and rumors of her infidelities reached Arthur's ears. He was hinted at that his wife was promiscuous in her sexual relationships. This was a period of feminist sentiments when women were forced to replace men who had gone to war and claimed equal freedom with them. But Dorothy's freedom seemed to go beyond old-fashioned morality. For many years, Dorothy teased her meek husband with obscene stories about hitchhiking and encounters with truck drivers. How often, lying awake at night, did he imagine his wife at a truck stop in the embrace of a sweaty masculine opposite of himself? Perhaps all that was needed for the growing madness in Arthur to engulf everything around was just a spark. Investigators found out that Dorothy was last seen on December 28th. Her relatives confirmed that her height was 1 meter and 70 centimeters. She weighed about 66 kilograms and had recently undergone surgery on her big toe joint. A local chiropractor had also treated her for a spinal condition. The doctor and a chiropractor were called for identification, and they definitely identified the body as the missing Dorothy Eggers. Although the exact reason for Arthur's terrible act remained unclear. The causes of tension in the family and growing discontent on both sides became evident. Later, the prosecution would state that Eggers' motive stemmed from a combination of jealousy, financial stress, and a desperate desire to free himself from his wife's toxic influence. On January 19, a new deputy sheriff reported important information to his colleagues. He had recently purchased a 1940 Plymouth sedan from Eggers for $800. During the transaction, the buyer noticed that the registration certificate was made out in Eggers' wife's name. Arthur replied that he would get his spouse's signature and everything would be in order. Marie, the older of Dorothy's nieces, at Arthur's request, went with him to the Department of Motor Vehicles and signed the documents in her aunt's name. Before this, to fulfill the request, she practiced Dorothy's signature several times. In the end, Eggers signed the certificate of transfer of ownership on behalf of his wife. When the deal was being made in the courthouse, Arthur told the deputy sheriff that his wife was waiting outside. However, the woman the buyer saw was much younger. Later, he identified the niece Marie as the woman Eggers had introduced as his wife. Meanwhile, the real Dorothy was already a nameless, headless corpse. When forensic experts examined the Plymouth, they found that the trunk had been recently cleaned. But in tiny corners and cracks, type A blood remained, the same type as Dorothy's. A check of weapon ownership documents showed that Eggers had a .38 caliber revolver. Bullets of the same caliber were found in the woman's body. While Arthur was at work, investigators searched his house and found several more type A blood stains in the couple's bathroom. Arthur Eggers was arrested on January 22, 1946, on suspicion of murder. Over the next 5 days, he was interrogated at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office. Arthur confessed to forging Dorothy's signature to sell the car but denied killing his wife. He also admitted to giving away her clothes to charity, but only because he believed she would in return. Police discovered that on January 4th, Arthur had sold his wife's wedding ring to a jeweler for $10 using a fake name and given a non-existent address. Arthur was charged with grand theft in connection with the fraudulent sale of his wife's car. Without a confession to murder, this was the only way to keep him in custody. The man was placed in a pre-trial detention cell. The walls were made of the same gray brick as in local houses, but instead of a wide window, the cell had a barred opening with metal rods. Inside it was no brighter than evening twilight, even at noon. There Arthur was visited by his niece Marie. The girl came to find out one single question: did he kill Aunt Dorothy? She was troubled by the blanket in which the body was wrapped. That blanket was on the bed, Marie calmly stated. Which bed? Arthur quickly asked. It was on my bed for a while, and then I saw it on yours. Arthur thought long about his answer. The girl is lying, he finally said, addressing the officer standing next to Marie. On January 7th, detectives subjected Arthur to a 4-hour lie detector test, but the results, alas, were inconclusive. The subject was too nervous and agitated to give the detectives coherent answers. Arthur continued to insist on his innocence until they brought in Robert Jones, a retired deputy sheriff. They had worked together for a long time and Arthur respected this man. Art, I believe you are guilty, Jones stated firmly. I think you'll have a better chance if you confess. Come clean. All right, Bob, Arthur sighed. Okay, I did it. I'll tell you everything. and Arthur told his story. On December 28th, he was returning home from work around 1 in the morning. Arthur, walking along the dimly lit streets, inwardly laughed at the imaginary monsters waiting for him in the dark, behind palm trunks and manzanita branches. His true fear, the real monster, tormenting, giving no respite from hellish mental anguish, was waiting for him at home. Approaching the bungalow, Arthur heard the front door slam and saw a man quickly exit the house. Suspecting something was amiss, Eggers entered the house through the back door. He crept into the bedroom and found his wife naked. The room smelled of perfume, sweat, and some sharp, cheesy odor. The bedroom was the same, familiar, but everything in it seemed to have become alien. Eggers felt dizzy. "I'm going to leave you and go to Bob," Dorothy said matter-of-factly. It was always Bob this, Bob that. Arthur had been hearing this Bob's name for several years. He felt rage boiling inside him, and on one single thought pulsing, he would no longer allow his wife to cheat. This needed to end once and for all. Dorothy, calmly lying on the crumpled sheets, asked, "So, what are you going to do about it, you pathetic slug?" And what could Arthur Eggers do? He rushed to his side of the bed where the dresser stood and pulled a revolver from the drawer. Arthur claimed that he flew into a rage and decided to chase after the man, but Dorothy tried to stop him. If he had been a bit more masculine and noble as Dorothy dreamed, Eggers would have rushed in pursuit of the lover. However, Arthur only waved the gun after the departing Don Juan and instead got into a fight with his wife. The struggle spilled over into the bathroom, where they fell to the floor, and then, as Arthur claimed, his gun accidentally fired twice. Left with the body on his hands, Eggers, without much thought, dragged the dead Dorothy into the bathtub. There he dismembered her with a saw, separating the head and hands from the torso. He wrapped the torso in a blanket, put it in the trunk, and dumped it in Waterman Canyon. Afterward, Arthur cleaned out the house and the car in which he had transported the body. Finishing his confession, Arthur assured Robert Jones that he still loved his wife. "I'm sorry, I didn't want to kill her. I will always love her." The next morning, Arthur led the detectives along the mountain road. Newspaper reporters followed hot on their heels and took a shot from an impressive angle, showing Sheriff Shea pointed out to Eggers where the body was found. In another, Arthur demonstrates to the detectives how he threw his wife's headless body into the ravine. Arthur told the police where he had hidden the murder weapons. That's exactly where the detectives found them. There were fatty traces and human blood on the gun. Later, bullets fired from the revolver were matched with the bullets found in the body. They matched. Numerous pieces of fabric, bones, and fatty deposits that had stuck to the saw's teeth were also discovered. The saw handle had the initials AE. A rather large bone fragment was firmly stuck between the saw blade and the handle. During 5 days of interrogation, Arthur Eggers told the investigators lie after lie. Although he confessed to the murder, he continued to lie to mitigate his guilt. He allegedly found the gun and saw in his house several days after his wife died, and since he thought someone had planted them there to frame him, he disposed of the murder weapons. As the investigation progressed, the true horror of Dorothy's fate became evident. She was killed by gunshots, but the decapitation was not just an act of violence but a calculated attempt to prevent identification. The main question remained: what did Arthur do with the head and hands? After Captain Gordon Bowers, the chief detective of the Sheriff's Department's Homicide Division, and a detachment of 400 Boy Scouts spent several hours searching, pushing through dense thickets 32 kilometers from where Dorothy's body was found, Eggers changed his version of events. The day just happened to be unusually cold, and investigators later surmised that Arthur was tired of standing in the chilly wind. He wanted to be somewhere warm, so he decided once again to play cat and mouse with the detectives. "Well, it's terrible to tell you such things, but the truth is," he said with a mocking smile, "I destroyed Dorothy's head and hands in the trash incinerator." The search in the ravine ceased and moved to the Eggers' yard. Sifting through the ashes in search of charred remains, detectives asked Arthur what time of day he burned the remains. "Well, in the morning, of course." "It's forbidden to burn anything in the trash incinerator after noon," replied this law-abiding citizen. Investigators collected the ashes of analysis but would found no bones or teeth. Like the deputy sheriffs, Eggers knew that teeth should have survived, and he had another lie ready for this. Dorothy had plastic dentures, and I assume they must have melted completely. The day after his first confession, Arthur completely changed his story, including the time and method of Dorothy's murder. He's lied so much that we're going to clarify his story once and for all, Captain Gordon Bowers told reporters. There is some truth in his words, but most of them are lies for self-preservation in an attempt to avoid a first-degree murder charge. He's trying to show that there was no premeditation on his part. By the time the grand jury handed down the indictment in the late February, Arthur had changed his version again. He had never killed his wife, and the body found in Waterman Canyon didn't even belong to Dorothy. She was still alive, and the disappearance was part of his wife's cunning plan to get back at him. When the funeral home director approached Eggers with a request to arrange a decent burial for Dorothy, Arthur refused to pay the expenses as he claimed he had nothing to do with the dead woman found in the San Bernardino Mountains. This story contradicted his sleepmate 5 days after the confession. "I swear by these raised hands," Arthur then dramatically proclaimed from his prison cell, "that no one will ever know what I did with them," implying that no one would be able to uncover the whereabouts of Dorothy's head and hands. In the first days after the arrest, Arthur hired a lawyer. James Starrett was a short, round-faced man with fashionable ties, a mop of curly hair, and extremely assertive in his work. During his client's indictment by the grand jury, Starrett made bold statements. He claimed that the confession was inadmissible as it wasn't made in writing. The defense attorney also protested the indictment itself, which didn't even mention the fact that Dorothy Eggers was missing. "This body could be the headless horseman from Sleepy Hollow," Starrett said. His argument in favor of the ghostly character from the legend of Sleepy Hollow was that Dorothy wasn't missing at all, and without the head and hands that could help confirm identity, that state didn't even have grounds for a criminal case. But the judge dismissed the motion. Starrett's legal objections were overwhelmed by forensic evidence, and his client's trial was scheduled for May. Dorothy Eggers' body was found in a ravine, but evidence pointed to her being killed at home. When Arthur's confession was refuted, the Los Angeles County Prosecutor's Office pieced together the forensic evidence. The list was quite impressive. Blood type match from the trunk and bathroom with Dorothy Eggers' blood type. Ballistic match with the Eggers .38 caliber pistol. Fragments of adipose tissue and bones found on the sew marked with initials AE. White-green blanket from the Eggers home in which the body was wrapped. Hair from the torso match that found on Dorothy's comb. Positive identification of the body by the doctor and chiropractor. In an exclusive interview Eggers gave to a journalist while in jail, he swore he had too cowardly a heart to commit murder. "I couldn't even kill a rabbit," he assured. But it wasn't a rabbit that was killed. It was much more serious. The trial of Arthur Eggers began on May 6, 1947, when the prosecution approved potential jurors. Arthur's mousy face with his darting blue eyes and constant wringing of hands told reporters of his great anxiety. Justice Clement Nye presided in the Superior Court. The hearing began with testimony from a forensic expert who competently and accessibly presented the forensic evidence to the jury. Dorothy's nieces, whom the newspapers also called the couple's adopted daughters, were the main witnesses. Marie recounted how Arthur asked her to sign for Dorothy so he could fraudulently sell his wife's car to a deputy sheriff. She and Lorraine identified the blanket in which the body was wrapped. A neighbor stated that on January 1st, she saw with her own eyes Arthur Eggers vigorously cleaning the trunk of his wife's car. And the tenant Lester Loomis denied ever having an intimate relationship with Dorothy. He heard nothing and knew nothing. In his opening statement, defense attorney Starrett called Dorothy Eggers a harlot who encroached on the sanctity of marital bonds and that she was accidentally shot during an argument. His legal strategy was simple: blame the victim and evoke sympathy for his client, who had to endure an unfaithful shrew of a wife. Our evidence will show that Mrs. Eggers was a domineering, strong-willed woman who loved to attend dances alone and meet men, Starrett told the jury. For a long time, rumors of his wife's infidelity reached Eggers. When he saw with his own eyes the truth of these rumors, there was a blinding flash in his consciousness, and he grabbed the gun. During the struggle, Mrs. Eggers was accidentally shot. The main witness for the defense was Arthur Eggers himself. James Starrett considered this a reasonable move because if anyone could prove to the jury that his client was insane, it was the insane client himself. Under his lawyer's guidance, Arthur told the jury that their marriage was happy, but everything changed a year or two before Dorothy's death. She told her husband that she was starting to change her life, and since then it became difficult to get along with her. Arthur began to hear rumors that while he worked late at the station, his wife started going to dances where she met men. Eggers said he never believed these rumors because he trusted his spouse and didn't pay much attention to them. Shortly before Dorothy's disappearance, Arthur had an argument with her over Christmas gifts. She mocked him for not buying a gift for their tenant, Lester Loomis, calling her husband a miser. Arthur recounted that he was returning home from work on Sunday, December 28th, when he heard the front door slam and saw a tall man run down the street. I entered the house and found my wife in the bedroom. She was naked, Eggers testified. I told her I was going to stop this kind of behavior, and I took my gun out of the dresser drawer. Dorothy grabbed me and we started fighting in the bedroom. She pushed me into the bathroom and we fell. A shot rang out. The next thing I remember is sitting in the toilet crying and scared. And then I realized I was in the car and there was someone else in the car, and he kept saying she's in the back. I realized I was driving and I kept hearing his voice. She is in the back in the trunk. I stopped the car and looked in the trunk, but it was empty. I thought it was all a bad dream, but when I returned home, Dorothy wasn't there. According to his testimony, Eggers remembered only one shot, and he couldn't identify the other person in the car who was supposedly talking to him. He drove to Long Beach, where he stayed until dawn. Then he returned home and fell asleep. Arthur's explanation for why he didn't call a doctor for his wife after he shot her with a pistol was as follows: I didn't know if she was badly hurt or hurt at all, but it seemed to me that a bullet had hit her, and the next thing I remember is that I was already in the car. Did you intend to harm your wife? Starrett asked his client. In a dramatic pose and clearly overacting, Eggers rose from the witness stand, raised his hand as if taking an oath, and in a righteous voice declared, "No, God is my judge, I never had any thought of killing my wife. I loved her." "Do you know where she is now?" Starrett asked. "Sometimes I think she's dead, sometimes I think she's alive and laughing at my predicament," Eggers sighed. "But that body I saw in San Bernardino didn't belong to my Dorothy." After Arthur's cross-examination by the deputy district attorney, Starrett called his surprise witness. Lloyd Wayne Cuthbert testified that someone else, not Eggers, had dumped the body into the ravine. Cuthbert told the jury how on the night of January 2nd he helped an unknown man change a tire. This was not far from where Dorothy's body was found, and the man's hands were bloodied. While the courtroom buzzed with excitement over this new development, the prosecution calmly called its own surprise witness to refute the defense's insinuations. This was former Marine Fred Metaski, who stated that he was the mysterious man in the San Bernardino Mountains that evening. Metaski admitted that his hands were indeed bloody when he was changing a tire on the roadside. The day the man had gotten married, and he cut his hands when removing the traditional tin cans tied to the rear bumper of his car. The jury's verdict of guilt came as no surprise to anyone except Arthur Eggers. As the court bailiff read out the sentence, the small defendant blinked rapidly behind his gold-rimmed glasses, but showed no other emotions. A few minutes later, he told his lawyer, "How could they? It wasn't Dorothy's body. I know it's not her body. This is absolutely unfair." Although the jury of 10 women and 2 men found Eggers guilty, a legal issue arose during deliberations. This was a first-degree murder charge, which meant the death penalty. The jury for a man sent a note for the judge asking if they could sentence Eggers to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. Clement and I wrote back, no, but the jurors didn't want to send Arthur Eggers to the gas chamber. They delivered their guilty verdict without a sentencing recommendation. The judge dismissed the jury and was forced to convene a new panel as he considered the previous one biased. This was a huge blow to the defense. On June 4th, Arthur officially resigned from his job at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. In his letter to Sheriff Eugene Biscaylos, Eggers wrote, "I will always have great respect for you and your department." At the end, he demanded that all accrued sick leave and vacation pay be transferred to his account in the county jail. The hearings on Arthur Eggers' sanity began on June 11, 1947 and lasted 2 weeks. 3 psychiatrists confirmed that he was sane, and then Arthur himself was called to testify to answer this question. "Do you think you're in your right mind?" Starrett asked. "Of course, I'm in my right mind," Arthur exclaimed in response. One of the Eggers' 2 sisters, Etta Williams from San Francisco, painted a picture for the jury of generations of madness in their family. According to her, their father, Frederick Eggers, a former San Francisco County sheriff, had hallucinations that the late Governor Richardson was going to appoint him as the warden of San Quentin prison. Hearing this, Arthur suddenly jumped to his feet, pointing his finger at the sky, and shouted, "May his spirit rest in peace." After the defendant was ordered to sit down and keep his mouth shut, Arthur's sister also recounted that as a child her brother had fallen badly several times, after one incident even losing consciousness for 7 or 8 hours. Perhaps there was brain damage. The new jurors didn't agree with this. On June 9th, a jury consisting of 11 women and 1 man decided that the defendant was of sound mind when he killed his wife Dorothy and dismembered her body. Arthur Eggers wasn't insane, he was insanely strange. His only response to the verdict was, "It's still not her body." For some inexplicable reason, Arthur clung to the ephemeral belief that if the woman's body found in the ravine didn't belong to Dorothy, then he was innocent. If he said it wasn't her, then it wasn't her, and everyone should just take his word for it. The judge sentenced 42-year-old Arthur Eggers to death in the gas chamber. As he was led back to jail, Arthur continued to deny that the body belonged to his deceased wife. "Someday, somewhere, she'll appear and make fools of all the prosecutors," he giggled. "She is probably waiting to hear what will happen to me." But this epochal return from the dead was not to be. A month later, the mother and son funeral home buried what was left of Dorothy Eggers in the Valhalla Memorial Park Cemetery in North Hollywood. There is no memorial plaque or any markings on her grave. Over the next 2 years, Arthur's new lawyer, Berwin Rice, fought for his client, filing court petitions, appeals, and stays. Arthur Eggers was to be executed on February 6, 1948, along with Admiral Dewey Adamson, as the gas chamber was designed for 2. But 9 hours before the execution, both condemned men were granted a 10-month stay. Federal judges needed time to clarify constitutional issues in Adamson's case. Since 1938, gas had been the usual means of execution at San Quentin, despite the fact that when it was first tested on an animal, everything went wrong. To become a victim of hydrogen cyanide, or in other words, prussic acid, it took the pig placed in the chamber more than 35 minutes instead of the expected 15 seconds. But this didn't prevent the fact that for almost 6 decades, inmates of San Quentin were executed in this way. Most of the condemned were familiar with the famous San Quentin prison warden Clinton Duffy, a man without negative bias but also without sentimental sympathy. Duffy's memoirs preserved an episode about his meeting with Arthur Eggers, convicted of murdering his wife. Duffy, being a prison reformer, came to the conclusion that the deterrence theory doesn't work. This idea was the threat of capital punishment for crimes should prevent murders. Therefore, first of all, Duffy asked Eggers an important question. "Arthur, what the hell made you think you'd get away with it? You surely knew that anyone who commits murder, even a policeman, could end up here." "I didn't think about it until it was all over," Eggers said. "Why didn't the prospect of the gas chamber stop you from reaching for the gun?" Duffy continued to ask. "It wouldn't stop anyone, not even a pure madman," Arthur replied. and I was completely beside myself. I caught my wife cheating and was going to kill her so she could never cheat again. I had no other thought. Not even about the gas chamber? Gas chamber? Eggers spat out these words contemptuously, looking through the bars of his cell. To hell with it, Warden. The gas chamber does only one thing, it kills people. But I bet it never prevented a murder. I used to believe in capital punishment because I thought that, for example, if a guy killed a cop, he could be executed so other guys wouldn't do that. But it doesn't work. With or without a gas chamber, guys will always kill cops. People will always kill people. You can't control anger or passion or greed or jealousy or fear. These are the causes of most murders. Only psychos and a state kill in cold blood. Everyone else has their reasons. That summer, lawyer Rice continued to fight in vain for his client, but the final plea to the governor for clemency was rejected. On Friday, October 15, 1948, at 10 o'clock in the morning, at San Quentin prison, Arthur Eggers was strapped to a steel chair in a mint-colored gas chamber. Under the seat was a container with sulfuric acid, distilled water, and sodium cyanide crystals. The executioner pulled a lever that mixed the three substances together. 2 months after Eggers' execution, a bullet-riddled human skull was found a mile and a half from where Dorothy's body was discovered. Initial hopes that it belonged to Mrs. Eggers quickly evaporated. On August 9, 1954, 15-year-old twins Peter and Paul Gita found a human skull while hunting in Eaton Canyon near Pasadena. 3 weeks later, police announced that photographic comparison with the skull with Dorothy's photographs irrefutably proved that the skull does not belong to Mrs. Eggers. In his constantly changing testimonies, Arthur Eggers told sheriffs from 2 counties that he had wrapped the head and hands in a newspaper and dropped the package from a cliff near Panorama Point. After deputy sheriffs and 400 Boy Scouts searched the area for several hours, Eggers said he had deceived them and that he had actually burned the remains in the trash incinerator behind his house. Later, law enforcement representatives concluded that Arthur's first statement about throwing away the remains near Panorama Point was most likely true. Dorothy Eggers' head and hands were never found.